We came over in a hurry, and we left in a hurry.
One day I was going to come back.
The war's changed people in Bardstown.
I never said goodbye.
It's been more than 20 years since America lived through the Vietnam War, the only war the U.S. ever lost. Today, it still brings heartache, suspicion, and questions. Questions these men from Bardstown's Battery C felt they could only answer back on their battlefield in Vietnam.
Well, we're here. I guess I can't believe it's 6, 7 years later. Weird. Especially proud that I came back.
For the first time, 7 members of the 138th Artillery Unit returned to the place where they fought, and the place where many died.
I've got the opportunity to do what I wanted to do for 25 years. I never said goodbye.
It's a battle that didn't change the course of the war, but changed the entire town of Bardstown, Kentucky.
This had to be the darkest hour of the day in my memory.
The Vietnam War arrived on Bardstown's doorstep in 1968. That's when 106 men from the National Guard unit would be called to duty.
We will not surrender, and we will not retreat.
A duty they believed was to serve their country and stop the spread of communism. Vietnam was now making its way into the heartland, and the tiny town of Bardstown was firmly in its grip.
So it was like, well, taking the whole town, in other words, you know, when the men were gone. I mean, we were all so close together.
A closeness that would follow Battery C to Vietnam. The men who grew up together would stay together. It was a bond that would make their year in Vietnam tolerable. But it was that same bond that would make the night of June 19th, 1969, so devastating. The night the North Vietnamese overran Fire Base Tomahawk.
I can remember turning 2 flips in the air and saying to myself, I'm dead.
5 men from Battery C would die in that battle. So these 7 men returned to say goodbye to their fellow soldiers, to say goodbye to their friends.
Brothers. Just quite simply brothers.
On this trip, the men of Battery C come full circle, with their past, with their friends, and with a country that has been calling them back, a country they left so quickly.
Let's see, certainly surprising.
It's a time to renew old friendships, and a chance to make new friends.
Take it. I got, how much?
With the new generation in Vietnam who knows little about the war they fought, a war these veterans say must be remembered.
It's our obligation, the remaining people, to carry the torch, to light the way, so that maybe we can minimize these things from ever happening again.
The men from Battery C say that's their mission now, their bond to each other, their past, and the future.
The men of Bardstown's Battery C, those who were lost.
The hurt that they were killed in such a fashion 26 years ago is still there.
And those who survived to make the second tour when we continue.
The cameras click, but the picture can't begin to capture all this wall has to say.
I didn't realize it was this big.
Big enough to tell the story of the Vietnam War and all the lives it took. Names that these veterans from Bardstown recognize.
The heart does a lot of flip-flop. You know, these were people we knew and grew up with and went to school with. And you know, the hurt that they were killed in such a fashion 26 years ago is still there.
The Vietnam War would span nearly 10 years, dominate 2 presidencies, and nearly tear America apart. It would also tear families apart, killing more than 58,000 Americans.
How many names are in one of these sections, you think?
These eyes are scanning for the names they know, people who were once friends.
See, Christensen was in the gun with Jim Moore.
They find more than their share.
Where do you see David?
Names that take them back to 1969.
So this would start the A's on June the 19th.
June 19th, the day 5 of their friends would die in Vietnam, a sacrifice that would secure them a place on this black granite wall. 5 names, soldiers with a face, a family, and a history with the men from Bardstown.
Yeah, right there.
Ronnie Simpson.
Oh, greatest personality in the world, greatest. He was just a likable guy. Everybody wanted to be around him. He was just that type of person.
Jim Moore.
Jim was just a very close friend. And, you know, we hunted together and fished together, and we shared some of the same interests, which made it a close friendship.
David Collins.
His presence was known, but not because he was doing anything flashy or flamboyant. He was just a real super nice guy.
Ronnie McElvoy.
He was a very good person and very friendly and easy to get along with.
And Luther Chappell.
Top. He was always known as Top. He was our first sergeant.
All those names on this wall. But the wall reflects even more. Even the men who came home can find a piece of themselves here. For many of these men, this was their first trip to the wall being a place where Vietnam veterans come to reconnect with friends they lost and feelings that won't go away. For many veterans, that's enough. This is where the journey ends. But for these men from Bardstown, this is just the beginning.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Da Nang International Airport.
This journey takes them back to where it all began.
Airplanes everywhere, people everywhere. Not a thing here now.
7 veterans from the 138th Field Artillery Unit look out the windows to see if they recognize a piece of the past, Vietnam.
Oh, look, what am I doing here?
I first landed here, I came off of a C-141, and they announced as we were making final approach that the airport was under attack.
They're landing in Da Nang, the same airport they arrived at 27 years ago. They're stepping back into a country they couldn't wait to leave, but a country that has been calling them back.
Oh, goodness.
A short bus trip will put them on the edge of the tarmac. Then it's a trip back in time, back to the time of the Vietnam War.
I know he was yelling, but we went someplace.
They hustled us over by
And somewhere over there, they remember seeing the dead and the wounded.
But they were coming right out of the field because they were still dressed in muddy and dirty.
They remember this airport with the deafening roar of planes taking off and landing. This time, it's the quiet that's deafening.
It's almost the same kind of shock, expecting to see some kind of activity and coming in here and we're almost the only people here. It's completely different. It's not something I had expected.
The hangars that once housed American aircraft sit empty. The control tower that launched thousands of bombing missions into North Vietnam now only guides a few planes from Vietnam Air.
It's amazing that all that infrastructure that we put in here is just being allowed to go to waste.
Does it feel strange being here?
Oh, no question about that. It's very strange.
The veterans say it's like the war never happened when you see this place. But that feeling will change as this journey continues.
Yeah, there it is.
It's like trying to find an old house in weather they came to know in Vietnam, rain.
Miserable mess.
They're looking for a place they lived for several months, several years ago. Trying to find what they called Hill 88, their old fire base, named that way because it's 88 meters above sea level. And through the mist, there it is in the distance.
Right here, right. Whoa. Right here.
Now, can we get to it?
See if we can back him up a little bit. Back up just a touch.
Where there used to be a road up Hill 88, there is now a power station where curious children stayed by wondering what would bring a bunch of foreigners here. The bus stops, the rain gear is on, and these veterans are home.
Okay.
The rain making it a perfect Vietnam homecoming.
Folks, this is entrance to 88, we think.
So the trek begins in the mud, back on turf that these men occupied during the Vietnam War.
Oh, yes.
Home of the 138th Field Artillery Unit, Battery C from Bardstown. But the turf has changed with time, so locals help the veterans find their way back.
They've done this. He said the trees were planted here 8 years ago. He didn't say why.
But those changes can't erase the pictures in their mind. They begin to remember what used to be here.
And there's the road that goes up to the top where the 101st was.
More than 100 men of Battery C shared this hill with the 101st Airborne Division. This was a busy place.
What's that? Chopper pads right over in here.
Yeah, for the battery pad was here. The Chinooks brought in stuff, you know, for the infantry up here.
This was fire direction right here.
And that's where you were? Fire direction was the brains of this fire base. Give the men in here a target to hit, and they'll figure out how to hit it. Those directions are then sent to the men inside these massive guns, 155 howitzers stationed all around the hill. They look just like big tanks, and they're capable of blasting the enemy up close or miles away. How far were your guns going?
I would say the 8 to 10 mile range was probably you know, somewhere in that area. We have fired in closer, but I believe if I remember correctly, 12 miles was the max.
I think it was right over here. I think.
On this side of the village?
Battery C was to keep this area, these nearby hills, clear of the enemy and keep the highway and railroads open so supplies could keep moving. If you could call any place in Vietnam safe, this would probably be it. Take a look around and you're going to see that this is the highest ground around here. Easy for Charlie Battery to defend, hard for the enemy to attack.
We occupied all the high ground, and for Charlie to get up the hill and get to us was just virtually impossible without us being able to protect ourselves from it.
It's been 27 years since the men of Battery C lived here, but even that much time couldn't wipe away all the signs of their stay.
Did you lose this?
Part of a rain poncho, something these men would have worn on a day just like this.
M60s. Found 2 or 3 laying here.
Clips used to hold their ammunition. They also find people who remember them and welcome them back.
And he feels very happy to see you back now.
He's happy
Very
to
good.
see them
Yes,
back.
yes.
Very good.
Really?
Very good.
Really.
First one we run into. Thank you.
The veterans did make friends with people in the villages below, children who were fascinated by the rides the Americans gave them on this piece of machinery called the mule. And as we leave Hill 88,
Picture the mule. Remember the little mule? Yeah. Just ride on.
a chance encounter with one of those children. His name is Wah, and he's all grown up.
Glad to see you again. Certainly,
Dạ, gặp anh là anh thì ông mừng lắm.
surprising.
In spite of a war and despite time, he recognizes the face of one of our veterans, Joey Keeling.
He said he was wondering maybe Joe's way too old now.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit older. Just a little bit.
And then it was time for us to leave. This goodbye, much different than the last one.
The second trip to the battleground and the reasons for returning.
I've got the opportunity to do what I wanted to do for 25 years.
When Vietnam, a second tour, continues.
The road to the old fire base winds its way through this misty mountain pass. Jody Hayden starts to chew his gum a little harder as we get closer to Tomahawk. The first time he made this trip, he was 22 years old. This trip brings him full circle.
It may be a way to turn the last page of a chapter of my life.
This is a trip all these men have wanted to make again, and just as it did 26 years ago, it's one that brings dread and anticipation.
I think I've got us found on the map.
With maps they kept from the war, seemingly knowing they'd need them again. Don Parrish first used those maps in 1968 on his first tour with Battery C. Now again, on his second tour.
There's a bit of closure that I'm due yet that should come from such a trip.
Closure to a time in their lives most wanted to forget, a time when 5 of their friends would die in a single night at Firebase Tomahawk. Sam Boone, who recorded much of their tour with this old film, would lose his best friend.
I never thought I'd ever see it again. I'm going to do something I've been wanting to do for 25 years.
To say goodbye, and for Joey Keeling to see why Vietnam, after all these years, seems to be calling him back.
There seems to be a kind of a draw.
All of these men have felt that draw for different reasons. Kent Bischoff says Vietnam has been in his thoughts ever since he left.
It's hardly a day went by that I didn't think of something there, you know.
When Ronnie Hibbs thinks of Vietnam, he thinks of luck. Lucky he survived.
I didn't figure we'd get out of there. Really, I just didn't.
Make it out of Tomahawk, a place they always had bad feelings about. Tom Razor says before they arrived at Tomahawk on his first tour, there had been several accidents there.
It seemed like a position that was jinxed from the start.
That position, that hill they called Tomahawk, is now right outside the window.
Sit.
26 years passes in an instant. The men of Battery C are back, trying to find their way back to the top of the hill.
That's it. That's the road going up to the hill.
I can't believe it's still here.
Yeah, it's still here.
A road that is all but washed away, but will still lead them to where their battle happened. It's an emotional journey.
Definitely, maybe more for me than the other guys. I just so close to Ronnie.
But they all knew it would be a tough return and a tough climb to come back.
I don't remember sweating this much, coming up that hill.
To an onlooker, you see a hill with a few trees, but these men see more. They see what used to be here.
And then below that was the communication bunker. That's the bunker I was in. And right to the right was the exec post.
And as they look around, the night of June 19th, 1969 comes into focus, and they begin to remember the men who died on this hill. Men who haven't been forgotten.
It would be a fatal mistake, I think, if we were to forget all those who gave so valiantly.
But these veterans say it would be a disservice just to remember the bad that happened here.
Like I said, the good times were best, the bad times were really bad. But we had a whole lot more of the good times, and that's what we really would prefer to spend our time thinking about.
So coming back would be a memorial and a celebration of friendship and the good times, and a private time to come to terms with what happened here.
I think it's an inner peace, and I just think it'll be easier.
The first tour was for their country. The second tour was for the men who died and for the men who came home. The men of Battery C.
When we return, the battle for Firebase Tomahawk and Bardstown's darkest hour.
Jody Hayden made a remark, I think maybe during the height of some of this, that this is going to kill the people back in Bardstown. It was raining, I remember that. We had a movie in the maintenance tent. It was a James Bond movie. I can't remember exactly the title. And during the movie, it rained really hard.
You couldn't hear anything because of the rain. It rained so hard.
Easy for the enemy to move around without being detected. And the heavy rain would camouflage any violations of sound that he would make. And after the movie was over, about the time the movie was over, it stopped, and just a real light drizzle. And it was over. We put the film up, and
turned in for the night.
They actually came up pretty much straight down the hill here. Another area on around a little bit further south of us, and then I think there's 2 positions on the opposite side of the hill. Well, they came through concertina wire, which is very sharp as a razor wire. They came through that. It was in there, I think, in triple layer, and they came through nude, which then allowed the skin to sense when they were against the sharpness of the razor wire, and that kept them from getting caught in the wire and kept the wire from rattling and that sort of thing. So they made good their entry into our perimeter. We
were still in the gun, and we had fired our regular rounds for that night. I just remember hearing something go off, a loud racket, and we looked out the side window, and we could see something burning over towards the exec post.
I heard another explosion, and just over the hill where the mess hall was, the tin and plywood from the mess hall was, blowing into the air. At that point, I thought it was incoming ammunition or incoming rounds from mortar, so I ran back into the bunker, yelling incoming to the people that was on my shift, and plus woke up Don.
He ran back in, came in, put his hand on my shoulder and woke me up, and we got everybody up and assumed a defensive position at that point.
So when I left Don's part of where they were sleeping, and I then went back to the radios at that point, because under those kind of conditions, then we knew that we needed to call in some artillery support. The first call went straight to headquarters battery so that they knew that we were under siege at that point.
Do you remember what you said?
Just told him that we were under attack.
What do you remember? You were asleep?
Asleep, and just waking up to someone saying that we're taking mortars.
Another voice I heard that they're in the perimeter. Maybe the Gooks are in the perimeter. I can't remember, but I do remember hearing someone saying they're in the perimeter.
I stayed in the living quarters area, probably right about here, I'd say. And I was watching. Jody Hayden was to my right, and we were watching the door and a window right here, trying to keep Charlie out of here.
The first thing I remember is a RPG round coming through the front of our bunker.
RPG meaning?
A rocket-propelled grenade.
When you heard it, did you know what it was?
I did, but I don't believe the rest of them realized what had happened. But I've been up north, and I've been under attack before.
I do remember the sound of the satchel charge bouncing across the wooden floor.
I'll never forget it. It was a little thumpy, thump, thump, thump. And it didn't, I couldn't imagine what it was, but it turned out to be, it was one of their little blocks of TNT came across the floor.
It's a sound you want to forget.
How loud?
Loud.
The noise I never heard. I just felt like something hit me in the back.
I couldn't really hear anything then. It was really limited what I could hear because of all the real sharp ringing.
I ran out of the bunker, and I looked back on the hill above us, and they were throwing satchel charges on top of the bunker. You could see them lighting the fuses to the satchel charges. So when I come out of the bunker, one of them threw a satchel charge in the doorway, so I jumped over the wall, and that's the sound there when it exploded. That's what burst in my eardrums.
We, Hank, fired one more round, and then Jerry James told me we're going to have to get out of here because stuff was hitting all around us. I made about 2 steps, and I guess they threw a satchel charge at my back or something, because I can remember turning 2 flips in the air and saying to myself, I'm dead. It just come out for some reason, but I hit the ground and I was still running in the same direction. Never did fall, never missed a step or nothing. Just kept trucking right on and went right in the bunker. First he threw a blanket around me and put the fire out. My shirt and my back of my hair was on fire. he pitched me a rifle, and I can remember shooting one round at it just to see if it was still going to work.
At that point, it really became chaotic because there were so many explosions going on, and there were people running everywhere.
I was hearing explosion after explosion. The only light we had was the flash from the explosions.
Flashing just enough that you could see silhouettes, see people, but not determine who.
So you never knew who the enemy was?
No, no, I never saw a person that I could say that's the bad guy.
We got a lot of people from the other bunkers that were almost destroyed, and they were coming to our bunker, and I can remember one time where there was a whole group that were half jumped and half blown through the door from another charge that was thrown in the hallway.
Jim walked into my bunker. I said to Jim, I didn't recognize his plight originally, and I said to him, Jim, are you all right? And with that, I put my hand on his shoulder like that, and my hand kind of skated off of his burnt flesh. And he said, Donald, I'm burnt up. And I tried to sit him down. He said, no, I'd rather stand. He seemed more comfortable just standing.
And you lost him?
5 days later.
We had enough light in the bunker that once people got in, you could figure out who was who. So I can just remember looking back and seeing people from time to time, and just that awful feeling of waste, this total waste of that what I thought was a Boy Scout outing in a faraway country had turned into a nightmare.
I crawled to the exec post, and I informed the people in the exec post that they were right behind us. And then they opened fire on the ones behind us.
They had to come over the break of the hill. It was kind of just a little mound, and when they did, they exposed themselves. So there was no way they could come over that and without suffering some damage. So they finally quit. They found that was a kind of a lost cause.
I guess from then on, we just waited for the plane to start dropping the flares. It was probably, well, I don't know. I don't really know how long it was from the time they started till the flares started. It seemed like 2 or 3 days, but it probably wasn't 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes or something like that.
The help I remember is ARA, which is aerial rocket artillery from helicopters. We had something called Puff the Magic Dragon, I think, that showed up. It was a DC-3 with miniguns and illuminating flares.
And small arms fire and explosions continued right up to daybreak.
I remember when daylight come, it was the biggest relief in the world.
Actually, I don't see anybody actually made it out that night. They pretty well had us, I'd say, where they wanted us. But either they messed up or we got lucky. Something went our way.
Why was I spared? Since I was outside the bunker, at a bunker that would have been a known enemy target, and I was saved. I was one of the lucky ones.
We had, ultimately, we had 10 out of our unit that were killed. Some of those would be days later. And we had, I think, either 42 or 44 wounded in various degrees.
How many of them from Bardstown among the dead?
From our guard unit, of the original guard unit, there were 5 that were dead.
First Sergeant Ross Cotton yelled at me about 5 o'clock in the morning, said, Sergeant Bischoff, get up, said, Charlie's been hit, First Sergeant's dead, and Collins is killed. He said, that's all I know about. And I said, First Sergeant, which Collins? I said, they're my friends. He said, I don't know, but he said one of them's been killed. As we drove up the hill, you know, the carnage was just unbelievable. It was a hopeless feeling, knowing already that you know, there were several of our people dead, and one of them had to be a close friend of mine. And not knowing, you know, that the others, you know, yeah, it was a terrible feeling.
Somebody asked me to identify the body. And when I looked at Ronnie, I didn't know I was looking at Ronnie till I saw his ring. He was a Mason.
Sam Boone would identify his best friend, Ronnie Simpson. Jim Moore would die 5 days later from the burns he received on Tomahawk. 3 other men from Bardstown's Battery C would die as well: Luther Chappell, Ronnie McElvoy, and David Collins. Collins was probably the first to die, surprising the enemy in the mess hall. A surprise that would cost him his life, but force an early attack by the enemy not all in place.
In my opinion, I think David Collins is probably responsible for a lot of us being here today.
This wreath from Bardstown to say thank you to David Collins and the other men, and a memorial service to say goodbye, something many couldn't do 26 years ago. They missed the first memorial service on Tomahawk because of their injuries. Now in life and in death, the men from Battery C come together one more time. And maybe now for the living, the war is finally over.
A small Kentucky town feels the brunt of the Vietnam War.
It was just a time of shock and sorrow and concern for the families.
Vietnam, a second tour, continues after this.
Bardstown, Kentucky, a slice of Americana, where men still gather at storefronts to swap stories, where an old-fashioned barber pole still turns outside the Benny and Crew barber shop, and where patriotism is still reflected, where Old Glory waved even during the Vietnam War, a time when most towns, even Louisville, were seeing protests, like this silent vigil in front of the Federal Building. Then Bardstown Mayor Gus Wilson never saw this reaction in his town.
I know Bardstown didn't have the protesters. I think we felt, well, no, this is something that majority of the people, and I think even our young people felt, this is something that had to happen, and when you do something for your country and you're called on, you owe your country.
So when duty called, the soldiers went. At first, one by one.
April 24 is 0.
Then, seemingly, everyone at once.
I heard it on WHAS at noon. Before I left from work one day, I heard it, and that we were being called up.
1968, the call-up of Battery C. More than 100 men from such a small town. A National Guard unit, a group that wasn't supposed to see battle. They'd be in Vietnam by year's end.
Yes, that was like, well, taking the whole town, in other words, you know, when the men were going. I mean, we were all so close together.
The war was now taking Patsy Collins' new husband, David. A war that would take a piece of most families in town.
In most communities, the Vietnam War could either bring you together or tear you apart. In Bardstown, like in most smaller towns, you stuck together no matter what. But no one had any idea back then how tough things would get for this small town, how much loss it would see.
This had to be the darkest hour of the day in my memory.
7 men from Battery C would die in Vietnam, 16 in all from the Bardstown area. David Collins would be among them. Patsy Collins would bury her husband. And Bardstown would be a city in mourning.
Specialist 4th Class, David Burr Collins, 138th Artillery. Date of death, June the 19th, 1969, age 24.
A city that would feel lost together would now grieve together at a memorial service for the entire town. A grief that reverberated all the way back to Vietnam. The men of Battery C knew the loss would be devastating at home.
Jody Hayden made a remark, I think maybe during the height of some of this, that this is going to kill the people back in Bardstown.
27 years have passed since Patsy Collins lost her husband. After all those years, she thinks of him every day.
He was always so caring, so loving, so gentle, considerate, always thought of other people's feelings.
But along the way, she says she managed to lose the bitterness over her loss.
I don't have the hatred that I used to have.
One person changed by the war, and a town that was as well. During the war, people began to question U.S. involvement in the way the war was being fought. Bardstown was still patriotic, but maybe not as trusting of our government.
The whole Vietnam War, to me, and very much so here, it changed our way of thinking of government. There's no question about it. I think for the first time, at least in my lifetime, that I felt that a sense of betrayal.
But that sense of betrayal never was taken out on the soldiers of Bardstown. The town may have wanted to turn its back on the war, but not its soldiers. They were heroes.
Anybody's a hero that goes into combat for their country.
And on the night Battery C returned to the Louisville airport, their tour finally over, only one place was on their mind.
What about you? What are you going to do? I'm going back to Bardstown myself.
And Bardstown would be there, ready to welcome them home, a place most still call home, even to this day.
When we return, the men of Bardstown's Battery C get a different view of Vietnam.
But I never dreamed that it would look the same now as it did then.
On the first tour, they looked like soldiers, young men dressed in olive green. But there are no uniforms on this second tour. These former soldiers now look and feel like tourists.
You know, this view across here was almost like you could be looking at Florida.
A second tour that brings them to Hanoi, a place they've never seen, and where one of our veterans would celebrate a birthday.
Birthday, dear Riley, happy birthday to you.
Not in his wildest dreams would Ronnie Hibbs have ever guessed a birthday in Hanoi, the most feared place for American soldiers during the war. Nor would they have guessed things in Vietnam would change so little.
But I never dreamed that it would look the same now as it did then.
The scenery in this country as they remembered it.
Don't kill them chickens, 108.
Bikes and scooters, the main transportation.
Well, I tell you, the guy that sells bicycles and motorcycles does all right.
Cars too costly for most people and too impractical for these city streets. Hanoi is the capital of Vietnam.
This is the landmark of Hanoi, and it's called the Temple of Ngoc Sơn. So it's
a city with an ancient past. That past still showing through in the temples that dot the landscape. But there is more recent history here too. History of the Vietnam War found here at Hanoi's Army Museum.
That's a Quad 50. You talk about a Hellraiser.
It's where old American weapons are put on display as trophies. And this is what the Vietnamese say is a downed U.S. B-52. But the veterans say it's more like a pile of rubble.
That's just a hodgepodge of stuff and things. That's not a B-52.
There's really not as much propaganda, at least in this area. I wonder if they got anything else.
I don't know. It's a good question. I haven't seen anything yet to really tick me off yet.
No, I mean, nothing.
The men came here knowing this would be Vietnam's version of the war. In fact, they expected worse than they found.
Every patch it served.
Kent Bischoff finds a book with pictures of all the U.S. campaign patches.
24th Corps, we were attached to that. We used that patch.
Even the ones worn by Battery C.
That one's on my dress green uniform.
So what's it like walking in the streets of Vietnam today, knowing that some of the people you're passing could have been the enemy? People you were supposed to kill, and people that may have once tried to kill you. That was a concern for these veterans until they began walking the streets.
What do you think, Sam?
That's the word.
They did get some stares, but they got even more waves and smiles from people welcoming them here. Are you surprised?
Yeah. I thought I'd have they would have the different attitude, but we're welcome here. We really are.
Thank you. That's it.
I got, how much?
Western dollars are also welcome here. We see a younger generation with no attachment to the past, only the future and where their money will be coming from.
He's a heck of a salesman, you know. You make a good car salesman.
And yes, there's Western influence here too, even in Hanoi.
Number one. All right.
And for these veterans, the true Vietnam experience.
Where's your seatbelt?
No seatbelt, sorry. This is a Ciclo.
What about, Joey?
What many Westerners think of when they think of Vietnam, where a few dollars lets you sit back while someone else does all the work. These veterans on tour in Vietnam, a tour that brings this day to a close, but shows our veterans
Hello there.
that maybe a new day is dawning in Vietnam. When America first became involved in Vietnam, it was a question of stopping communism. That was the call to duty, and Battery C was ready to answer.
I supported the reason that we were here.
Much of America felt the same way at first.
232 GIs killed and...
But by 1968, the war had made its way into America's living rooms as fighting made its way into the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Lost any men here? Well, I've got six people I've had wounded.
With a front row seat for the Tet Offensive, some Americans began questioning U.S. involvement. Even soldiers began to question the way they were being told to fight the war and began to question their own government. And in the end, American troops would pull out and South Vietnam would fall.
Being a part of a war that the United States didn't win is probably what's most unsettling to me.
The human loss is just as unsettling to the men of Battery C. It's that loss, that personal loss, that brought them back to their battle site one more time.
Especially proud that I came back.
The Vietnam War and the battle at Tomahawk have been on the minds of these veterans. Maybe not every day, but it's a weight they've carried for 26 years. This trip would help change that.
I do feel different. I really do. I feel lighter.
Tomahawk has always meant death. A trip back can't erase that picture, but it can give them a new way of seeing it. To see Tomahawk this way, a second tour to remember the camaraderie that was on this hill, with both the men who came home and those who didn't.
You know, as far as I'm concerned, they're friends for life.
Well, if I had to go back, I'd want the same ones, and I guess here I am right now back over here with some of the same ones, so.
These men, proud of their service.
They were willing to put their life on line for a group, for a country of people that probably many of them had never heard of.
Men who felt it was their obligation to go, and to go without question. But those same men after the Vietnam War, telling their own son or daughter it's okay to ask questions.
But if my son had to go under the same circumstances I did, I'd tell him not to go.
The men of Battery C, men who supported their country, but can't shake the feeling that their government didn't completely support them. Men who want closure, not by forgetting the war, but remembering it and coming to terms with it.
Didn't realize it was this big.
And remembering that with any war comes a price.
For sure, I'm more grown up. I don't care how grown up you are when you go into war, when you come out, you're more. I have an immense respect for the value of human life, and also a major recognition of how delicate it really is.
A complex human price written on a simple granite wall. A price written in 58,000 names, each with a face, a family, and a history shared by the men from Bardstown.
Vietnam, a second tour, continues.
They're hoping for normalizing the relationships.
The people of Vietnam and their thoughts on America's return to their country.
not good, no, good morning.
And a new struggle in Vietnam, making a Kentucky business successful in a foreign country. And finally, Gary Rodemeyer shares his own Vietnam tour.
The danger in Hanoi these days is getting across the street safely. Liken the roads to the Watterson Expressway.
Oh boy, this is worse than New York.
With no rules.
Do they have a means to their driving? Are they all trying to stay to the one side?
An American in Hanoi. Make that several Americans in Hanoi, a place only prisoners saw during the war.
It's strange, and they say things hadn't changed. That much has. That much has changed.
Americans can walk freely in Hanoi. That much has changed, but remarkably, little else has. Some of these scenes could date back to the last time these men were in Vietnam. The storefronts on the streets, the women with their vegetables and bamboo poles. These are pictures that these men could have taken on their last tour of duty.
Still, again, surprised that it looks so much like it did 25 years ago. No progression. They haven't gone backwards, but they haven't gone forwards.
The progression is subtle. The progress comes from wiping away remnants of the war. We see very few reminders of it until we come here.
The Hanoi Hilton, it was used as a prison of war camp for American pilots that were down during the war.
The Hanoi Hilton, the prison where American men stayed behind huge walls topped with electrical wire and shards of glass should they be tempted to escape.
Only the very, very strongest could have survived in there.
If it hadn't been for this reminder, this stop, you could almost forget there was a war here.
Holy mackerel, if walls could talk, you would not be able to live long enough to hear all the stories, I'm sure.
Those stories will live on, but the Hanoi Hilton won't. It's coming down, making way for a hotel. Despite a communist regime in power, capitalism appears to be rearing its head.
Don't nobody tell them where we live.
But in the country, it's making a living just to get by. Children will tend to the cattle used for plowing. And the #1 crop in Vietnam, rice, will provide the means to make a living. With their ankles submerged in water, these women stoop over to plant and harvest rice and other vegetables. In water that has leeches and snakes, they work from sun up to sundown. This is a typical village in Vietnam, where the amount of income doesn't necessarily coincide with the amount of back-breaking labor.
I work 7 days a week, and I work between 8 to 10 hours a day.
A typical way of life in Vietnam.
Per year, I earn about $5 to $700.
A typical annual salary in Vietnam. But certainly not typical beauty here. Vietnam is breathtaking in its natural beauty. Natural beauty that wasn't wasted on these former soldiers who came to the beach during their fighting days for a little R&R.
We used to bring our air mattresses, and we'd try to surf, and we'd have a ball at the beach.
That's right, American GIs on China Beach, with crashing waves instead of crashing guns for a brief period of time.
That's the Mosina.
And maintaining traditions that started so long ago. These veterans writing the names of their spouses in the sand, then and now.
I told Holly if I ever made it back over here that I would write her name in the sand one more time. And so I wrote her name in the sand 26 or 7 years ago.
Did it again today?
And did it again today.
A tradition that has stayed as familiar as this unchanged country. The countryside of Vietnam reveals a lot about its people, hard workers who rarely slow down with age. But that same countryside also hides many scars of the war.
I haven't seen any leftover destructions from the fighting, so I guess
They see some remnants from the war. They were surprised they didn't see more. These men also expected to see remnants of the war and the attitude of the Vietnamese people. But Vietnam is a country full of surprises. A country is curious about our TV cameras as it is about Americans. It's unusual to see a TV crew here, or former soldiers for that matter.
Yeah, we're at the market.
An older man figures out these men have a history with his country, and he realizes he has a history with them.
He was fighting, he was in the army in the Quang Nam area.
Jody Hayden wants to know what he thinks about Americans coming back.
What she's trying to say is that the feelings are very, very positive.
So we're welcome here.
You are welcome here.
With that, tension between two countries is reduced some by two men shaking hands.
One of the big concerns the veterans had about coming back in country is what kind of reception would they get? Would they draw criticism because of their past with the Vietnam War? The only thing, though, that they've been drawing are big crowds.
Many Vietnamese seem eager to become friends with Americans. It's a feeling shared by these former soldiers.
Live and let live. Bygones be bygones.
The veterans we traveled with are pleased that the U.S. is normalizing relations with Vietnam. They say it's time. So do many people in Vietnam.
They said that the Vietnamese have all forgotten about the war. It's all part of the past. It's long forgotten.
This shop owner in Hoi An is looking forward to a working relationship with the U.S. and other countries.
Okay, so in the future, Vietnam, as a country itself, is hoping for help from many other countries.
Come on, Sergeant Havard, you're overdue.
Some veterans of the Vietnam War, though, oppose normalizing relations, not wanting to do business with the enemy, with the same government they fought. Many also feel it's a government that hasn't told the truth about missing Americans and prisoners of war. Jody Hayden says normalizing relations, though, is more about the Vietnamese people than the government.
I think it's time to get the Vietnam conflict behind us and move on for the sake of the Vietnamese people.
That's nice work.
Yes, indeed.
The men from Battery C were invited into the homes of those people.
Oh, did he paint it?
Finding a different lifestyle than ours, but also finding virtually the same needs and wants as ours. You can see it in their faces that everyday life is still a struggle for many Vietnamese. Normalizing relations could make things a little easier by opening up Vietnam to the rest of the world. That would make American involvement this time around not a question of control or war, but a question of people.
In a moment, can three Kentucky businessmen find the American dream halfway around the world?
It's one of the last frontiers, so to speak, for trade and new opportunity.
It could be the most famous rooftop in the world, a rooftop that in 1975 the whole world watched. The rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, where in April of 1975 the rush was on for Americans to get out of a country about to fall. 20 years later, that same building is ready to reopen once again as the U.S. Embassy in a country ready to do business with America. The city now officially called Ho Chi Minh City, although most people still refer to it as Saigon. It's Vietnam's largest city with 4 million people, a place that has always been influenced by the West, and still is.
Good morning. Not good, no. Good morning. Good morning.
These women are learning to speak English here at the Asian Trade Alliance, a Saigon business with Louisville ties. They'll soon be in Saigon stores, using that English to sell American products. The makeup, Maybelline.
Because Maybelline's from the United States, we want to project that American-esque image. So when they come in, we ask them to use English just with a greeting.
That's Walter Blocker, and that's Marshall Eldred, wheeling and dealing for Asian Trade Alliance on the phone, their third partner back home. 3 men from Louisville trying to make the American dream come true in Vietnam. It's up to the Keebler elf to help.
What kind of store would you compare this to?
This would be, you could compare this to a Biggs or a Kroger. This is the best supermarket in Ho Chi Minh City.
This is City Mart, and it's here that Asian Trade Alliance, or ATA, sells some of its products, like Keebler crackers.
Yes, people have to know how uncommonly good Keebler cookies and crackers are.
Em mời chị dùng thử bánh Keebler của Mỹ đó chị mới qua.
ATA wants to get Keebler and Maybelline into several stores in Saigon. Keebler already has competition from Nabisco in Vietnam, so Eldred says it's up to his group to find the right place for Keebler products.
People who buy Keebler are generally middle to upper income and visit these growing supermarkets to do their shopping, whereas Nabisco's customer, you'll find Nabisco in a store like this, but you'll also find Nabisco in the kiosk on the main drag in Ho Chi Minh City, where anybody can buy. Right. That's what we're trying. Well, we have to find a niche.
Hello. I was going to tell you a little bit about Maybelline, what we're trying to do in this market.
Finding a niche for their products and themselves right here in Vietnam.
They could have started a business anywhere in the world. This choice is a long way home from Louisville. So why did they decide on a country half a world away and one that's so completely foreign to American business?
Because one of the last frontiers, so to speak, for trade and new opportunity.
The new frontier for American businessmen, with American products arriving by ship to a country thirsting for them. The only rough waters, restrictive laws in Vietnam, tricky about American ownership. So Eldred and Blocker work as consultants half a world away from home.
What do you miss the most about home?
Playing golf. My girlfriend, I hope she's listening, but in my family, very much.
Lots of people are watching, waiting to see if Vietnam will turn into a gold mine for American businessmen, with 3 Louisville men hoping to strike it rich.
The question of making peace with a former enemy. Some of Kentuckiana's most prominent Vietnam veterans speak out.
That we knew when we got there that we had to do so much time. We were all like prisoners.
Like a giver of life, the morning sun glows over the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Frankfurt. The sun that gave hope for survival in Vietnam remembers death. A sundial marks the victims etched in stone. Veteran Ron Ray, who helped create this memorial, remembers the meaning of sunrise.
Frequently you prayed, I would just like to see the sun come up one more time. So when the sun came up one more time, there was always a comforting sense that you'd made it through the dark night.
Time. It was the enemy. It was their ally. They all had a way of keeping track. It was a finite period for survival.
That we knew when we got there that we had to do so much time. We were all like prisoners. You know, we knew what the sentence was. 365 days.
That was the Vietnam tour. 1 year. 30 days longer for Marines. 2 Kentucky soldiers made it through. Ron Ray and Bill Roby. It was a lonely fight for survival. Each soldier by himself.
At the time that I went, which was in 1970, and going over there by yourself without any support and just being alone, that was very, very traumatic.
Then, coming home, they were still alone. There was no hero's welcome. Nobody wanted to talk about the war that had been life or death for 12 months.
I need a perimeter set up here.
And so Vietnam veterans buried the past and tried to forget, but they couldn't.
Vietnam's been a part of my life since I was 23 years old, and it will continue as long as I live, to be a part of my life.
But Bill Roby admits he's mellowed over the past 25 years. And although he has no desire to visit Vietnam, Roby says he wants to bury the hatchet.
In our life, we have to forgive and forget, and we need to move forward into the future. And those folks in Vietnam need to move forward into their future. And I'm all for normalization of relationships with the people of Vietnam, and I think we should trade with them, and I think we should get on with our lives. It's not over for me.
Meanwhile, Ron Ray has also passed up a chance to go back to Vietnam. And while he wants to get on with his life, he wants no part of relations with the government of Vietnam.
And the government in Hanoi cruelly manipulated our people. Congressman Sam Johnson from Texas said it very well, you know, that's the same government that tortured me and manipulated me for political purposes. And I'm not going to see them recognized and legitimized in the eyes of the world.
But perhaps the greatest damage still to be repaired in this war is between the Vietnam veterans and their own country. Ron Ray stands in the warm morning sunlight and speaks of one veteran, but also speaks for all.
He served his country, even if he didn't understand why. He was willing to go in harm's way because the country asked him, and the country needs to recognize him.
They are the names of a generation who answered the call, regardless of misgivings and lack of support. In their lonely fight for survival, they may have been the bravest of all.
Gary Rodemeyer shares a personal tour of Vietnam after this.
Mom and Dad said goodbye at the airport. I thought I was going to San Diego. I was really going to Vietnam. We were fresh out of college, and there was pride in that fresh white U.S. Navy uniform. Our ship was the USS Bear, an attack transport designed to deliver U.S. Marines and their gear to a beachhead. But in 1964, only military advisors were in Vietnam. Our duty was tedious, circling off the Vietnam coast in case they needed rescue. I was 22, an ensign, standing watch, keeping my ship in formation in the South China Sea 4 hours at a time. We began to feel like Noah, nothing but water, up to 40 straight days. We cruised and waited, tried to get some exercise while getting little news. We wondered what it was all about. Then, in November of 1964, our boats landed the first American Marines who would guard the air base at Da Nang. Those few troops would eventually become thousands. And soon from the air base, American planes were carrying lethal cargoes to the north. Walking the streets of Da Nang, we were able to buy an occasional Time magazine and read about the expanding war. In our own world, we found Vietnam was safe in the daylight, but night brought change. One day at twilight, a boat from our group went into shore to scout a new landing site. A sailor from our ship volunteered for that trip, and a Viet Cong patrol attacked them on the beach at Chu Lai. That sailor was the first person I knew that died in the Vietnam War. He would not be the last. Somewhere east of Vietnam, we held a memorial service, stared out at the gray sea, and then went back to work. We kept sailing, moving even more troops and cargo from Southern California to Southeast Asia. After 2 years and 3 trips to Vietnam, my tour was over, but others would take my place. I would come home. Many more would not.
It's a pretty awesome world, isn't it? I didn't realize it was this big.
It's just a lot of names.
I believe
he was in Jim's gun.
Yeah, I believe he's the one that got burned up inside the gun.
You know, these were people we knew and grew up with and went to school with, and you know, the hurt that they were killed, very, very much real, just like it was then.
It's just an interest that I've had for years to return for a visit someday.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Da Nang International Airport.
Oh, goodness. There seems to be a kind of a draw
to see the country just one more time in a different setting.
Jody, you were right. There's a power line going right across Tomahawk.
There's a lookout up there, too.
It sure is, yeah. I never thought I'd ever see it again. That's it. That's the road going up to the hill. Yeah. That's it's just washed completely away.
Then the command post was just a little further on the up the hill here where the first sergeant was killed.
And the wounded, for the most part, came down those steps and through a door in the back end over here.
Well, it was totally deafening from all of the explosions because there was explosions going on in the whole compound. And it really got chaotic because at that point, the bunkers behind us were starting to totally be destroyed.
It was a hopeless feeling, knowing already that, you know, there were several of our people dead, and one of them had to be a close friend of mine.
Like I said, the good times were best, the bad times were really bad. But we had a whole lot more of the good times.
Just the number of people that were killed that were known by so many people.
And we knew that there had to be just a terrible amount of concern among the residents of Bardstown.
Bad things happen, and they'll continue to happen. But every time those things happen, we should make every opportunity to learn by them.
I believe of all the wars that we've ever been involved in, that the lessons learned from this one are of the highest value to our future. I hate to say it, but I'm one of the last, I think, to finally say that they were lost with no value in return, and that hurts.